We thought we knew how fairy tales end. Since childhood, we were told stories where good always defeats evil. A prince saves the princess, a fairy grants a wish, and everyone lives happily ever after. A fairy tale is comfort. It's something you hear before bed, when it's dark outside, and the room smells like mint tea and grandma's blanket. But sometimes, a fairy tale stops being comforting. What if the ending isn't happy? What if magic doesn't save, but takes you away forever? And what if the tale isn't fiction, but a terrible truth, hidden in rhyme? The legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin is not a bedtime story. It frightens. Not because of rats, but because of adults who broke a promise, children who vanished, and a man no one knew who came from nowhere and led away 130 children. This story gives us no happy ending, only silence, and a terrifying question: what if it really happened? Because this tale has witnesses, and too many strange coincidences, so many, that it starts to feel real. Was it a myth, a mass delusion, a forgotten migration, or something darker? Let's look at what remains. A few records, a stained glass window, words carved in stone, and try to understand the tale that no one has been able to forget. For over 700 years, a celebration that turned into tragedy. In the middle of summer, in the year 1284, Hamelin lived as always, slowly, peacefully, as if time itself moves softer here than anywhere else. The small German town lay nestled among green hills. Morning mist rose above the Weser River. Church bells rang across the valley, answering the rooster's cry. Merchants arranged fresh bread on their stalls. Women beat carpets at their doorsteps. Children played barefoot in the yard. It felt like nothing could disturb this calm rhythm. But the peaceful morning turned into fear. At first, a soft rustle beneath the floor. Then, a squeak, faint but insistent. And soon, it was as if thousands of tiny voices whispered across the town. Rats. They came like a sickness. No one knew from where, as if they rose from the earth itself, from barns, from cellars, from rivers and fields. They appeared everywhere, bold, fearless, as if they knew nothing could stop them. At first, people laughed. We can handle a few mice. But after a week, no one laughed. The rats crawled into grain stores. They chewed through sacks. They stole bread right off the tables. At night, they slipped into beds, into cribs. They rustled in corners. They made people scream and shiver. It felt like the whole town belonged to them. Cats fled. Traps failed. Poison did nothing. The rats seemed to mock them, settling in homes of both rich and poor, sparing no one. Some even crept into the church, chewing candles and holy crosses. The people of Hamelin knelt in prayer. They begged for mercy, but the heavens stayed silent. No rain, no miracle, no sign. Only the same endless squeaking beneath their walls. And the growing feeling that the earth itself had cursed them. Some whispered it was punishment for sins. Others that witches were behind it, or dark magic. But the truth was worse. The city was not dying from rats. It was dying from fear, from helplessness, from the feeling that even God had turned away. And just when all hope seemed lost, a man with a flute walked into town, and everything changed. A stranger with a flute. At dawn, just as the town began to wake, a man appeared on the market square. No one saw him enter the gates. No one knew where he came from. It was as if he stepped out of the mist, a shadow bringing not answers, but new questions. He was tall and thin, with a face that looked foreign, maybe the face of a traveler, maybe something colder. His clothes were strange, stripes of red, yellow, and green, sewn to be noticed. He looked like a jester, or a puppet master, or a wandering performer. But that day, there was nothing funny in his look, only something unsettling. In his hand, a flute. Simple, wooden, no decorations. Yet something about it held everyone's gaze, as if it wasn't just an instrument, as if it held power. "I can rid your town of the plague," the man said. His voice was quiet, but somehow everyone heard. "My work costs 1,000 gold coins." The crowd froze. Some exchanged doubtful glances. Others, hopeful ones. They had lived in fear too long, lost too much. They wanted to believe. And though his voice was calm, there was a strange certainty in it, a confidence that made people uneasy. The elders didn't hesitate, they agreed. One crossed himself. Another bit his lip. The man just nodded. He said no more. He raised the flute to his lips and began to play. It wasn't music for dancing, not joyful, not festive. The sound was slow, hypnotic, like a thread pulling something unseen. Even the earth seemed to hold its breath. The melody spread. It wrapped around the houses. It slipped under doors. It sank into the cellars and crept between the cobblestones like water. And then the rats came. One, then a few, then a flood. They poured out of cracks and basements, from pantries, from wells, from the church, from everywhere. They moved like a line of soldiers, not afraid, not angry, just dancing, as if the music called them, and they could not resist. The stranger walked through the streets. Behind him, a river of gray fur and tiny feet. People hid behind curtains, held hands. They couldn't believe what they saw. It felt like a dream, like a scene from a play written long ago. He led them to the river Weser, and without turning, he kept playing. One rat jumped into the water, then another and another. Soon the entire swarm leapt in, silent, without a squeak. The music played on until the water became still and empty. It was a miracle. Hamelin froze, then burst into joy. People ran into the streets. They hugged each other. They cried. Some fell to their knees. Others shouted, "Glory," or called for their children. It was safe again. The rats were gone. Fear was gone. Life could begin again, but the joy didn't last, because the man with the flute was still standing by the town hall, and he was waiting, betrayal. When it was all over, the town was celebrating. The bells rang all day. Shopkeepers offered food on the streets. Children ran and laughed, no longer afraid of dark basements or whispers in the walls. The rats were gone. The city could breathe again. But among the joy stood one man, the same one who had performed the miracle. He didn't dance. He didn't drink wine. He didn't take praise. He simply waited for what was promised. By evening, he entered the town hall. Behind a long oak table sat the elders, full, satisfied, cups of wine in their hands. The air smelled of roasted meat and pride. No one remembered fear. No one remembered the nights of scratching and terror. It all seemed like a dream now. "I came for my payment," the piper said calmly. His voice was quiet, but there was something icy in it. "Your payment?" one elder repeated. "Ah, yes, 1,000 gold coins," he smirked. "For a walk to the river? Rather generous for a tune, don't you think?" Another laughed. "Maybe we should call another musician. Perhaps he can play and bring the rats back." Laughter filled the room. Drunken, smug, hollow laughter. The piper didn't smile. His eyes were calm, but in that calm was something unsettling, almost inhuman. He looked at each of them slowly, then said softly, "I did what I promised. You did not." "What will you do, flutist?" one elder sneered. "The city is clean. The rats are gone. You are free to go your way. Go in peace, if you can." Silence stretched like a tightened string. The piper nodded. "You will regret this," he said quietly, and the laughter stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Only the wind touched the curtain by the window. Then he turned and left. No argument, no anger, no threat. He just walked away as suddenly as he had appeared. But the next morning, the town woke with a strange feeling. The air was heavier, the sun dimmer. Even the birds seemed to sing less. People couldn't explain where the chill came from. They didn't know yet that it wasn't morning fog. It was a warning. He came back, but not for the rats. Only a few weeks had passed. The town lived as before. Shopkeepers argued about grain prices. Women washed clothes by the river. Children played in the streets, chasing sunbeams on the stones. It seemed the horror was forgotten. But that Saturday morning felt different. The air was heavy, thick, as if the day itself knew what it was about to bring. On the calendar, it was the feast of Saints John and Paul, June 26th. Church bells called people to prayer. Nearly everyone gathered inside. Only the children stayed outside, laughing, playing, building little sandcastles by the tower. Their bright laughter mixed with the choir's singing, and in that sound there was so much life that no one noticed him walking down the street again, the stranger, the same one in the colorful clothes, as if stepped out of a fairground dream. But now there was no trace of lightness in his walk. His face looked paler, his eyes colder. He walked slowly, as if he already knew where to go. The sun caught on his flute, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath. He lifted it to his lips and began to play. The music was different this time, not bold, not triumphant. It was soft and sorrowful, as if someone were crying through the notes. It sounded human, almost tender, and unbearably beautiful. The first to stop was a little girl, the same one who had been rolling her hoop the day before. Then a boy with a wooden horse, then another, and another. Soon dozens of children were staring at the piper. He didn't turn, he just played. And they followed, silent, entranced. The melody shimmered in the air like golden threads, wrapping the streets, the houses, the walls. No one saw when the children disappeared around the corner. They walked across the cobblestones, toward the town gates. Behind them, the gates slowly closed, as if fate itself refused to let anyone follow. They climbed higher and higher along a path between the hills, where the air was cool and dark beneath the pines. The flute played on, steady, flawless. The children's faces were calm, peaceful. Some even smiled. It looked as if they were walking to a celebration. When they reached the foot of the mountain, the rock opened. A narrow crack appeared, just wide enough for a doorway. The sunlight fell upon it, and in that light it looked almost magical. The piper stepped inside, and the children followed. The last boy, the one who limped, turned back, as if he wanted to say something, but didn't have time. The mountain closed, the music stopped. Down below, the grass swayed in the wind. In the church, the service had just ended. People stepped out into the sunshine, smiling, blessing the day. They didn't know yet that this day would become the darkest in the history of their town. They were never seen again. When the church bells rang to mark the end of the service, people stepped outside into the warm June sun. The air smelled of fresh bread and blooming linden trees. Mothers smiled, chatting, ready to call their children for lunch, but the streets were empty. At first, it seemed strange. The children were always the first to run, with hoops, with sticks, with laughter shouting, "Mama!" But this time, no one ran. No voices, no laughter. Only the wind pushing a doll with a torn ribbon across the square. "Where are they?" one woman asked. "Where are our children?" There was no answer. Someone ran to the next yard, others to the river. But where there was once noise and joy, now there was silence. A deep, unbearable silence. And then 3 children appeared at the church gate. A boy with a bandaged leg, a girl with a scarf tied tight over her ears, and another, pale, trembling, as if he had just escaped a nightmare. They spoke through tears, stumbling over words, pointing with shaking hands. They told about the music, about the man in the colorful clothes, about how everyone followed him, not wanting to, but unable to stop. How they walked out of town, toward the hills. How the mountain opened, like a door to another world. How they all went inside, and never came back. Parents ran, some barefoot, some still in church clothes. A mother with loose hair ran ahead, screaming her son's name until her voice broke. Fathers broke the gates, searched the paths, dug into the earth at the foot of the mountain. But there was nothing, no footprints, no cries, not even an echo. Only the hollow sound of emptiness. That night, silence hung over Hamelin, a silence deeper than any disaster before. No songs, no laughter, no clinking of dishes, only muffled sobs behind the walls and the slow toll of the bell, as if the town itself was mourning those it would never see again. 130 children were gone, forever. Since then, the streets where they once played became haunted. No one laughed there. No one sang. No weddings were held. Even the birds avoided that place. People said, "The town has lost its soul." And truly, Hamelin grew old in a single day. In its heart remained only silence, the kind that chills the blood, the kind where, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that flute. Is it just a fairy tale or not? For centuries, this story was told by the fire, as a ghost tale, a warning, a bedtime legend no one took too seriously. So the piper led the children away, just a sad invention, a fable. That's what people said. That's what they hoped. Because it's easier to live when you believe it's only fantasy. But historians, they're stubborn. They dig through the dust of time, looking for things the world forgot. And when they started tracing the origins of this legend, something began to disturb them. In a monastery manuscript written in the mid-14th century, they found a short note. It was plain. No symbols, no metaphors, just facts, like any old chronicle. In the year of our Lord, 1284, 130 children of Hamelin were led away by a piper and never returned. No mention of rats, no miracles, just a cold, simple sentence. And then, the stained glass. In St. Nicholas's Church, one of the oldest in Hamelin, a window was installed at the start of the 1300s. It showed a tall man in colorful clothes, surrounded by children. He stood at the foot of a mountain, holding a flute. The children's faces looked peaceful, almost happy. The window stood for more than 300 years. It was destroyed in the 17th century, but its description survived. In letters, in town records, in memories. Based on them, modern artists have tried to recreate it. And here's what's strange. Not a single source calls it fiction. No one writes symbol or allegory. No, they all say, this is what happened. And on the wall of the old town hall, built in the 15th century, a message was carved in stone. In the year 1284 after Christ, 130 children born in this town were led away by a piper into the mountain. Those words were carved in public, not hidden, not erased. They stood as memory, as a scar, as a wound the city could never heal. So maybe this isn't a fairy tale. Maybe it's a chronicle, a record of something no one could explain. And so, they made a legend, just to make sense of it, just to survive. What if the children didn't die? The legend of the Pied Piper sounds like a tragedy, a nightmare in which children vanished, gone forever. But what if it wasn't like that? What if no one died? What if they simply left? Among the many theories, there's one surprisingly free of magic, but no less frightening, at least for those who were left behind. In the Middle Ages, Germany, like all of Europe, followed the law of primogeniture. All inheritance, land, and wealth went to the eldest son. The rest left with nothing. No home, no future. Some became monks, others soldiers, and some left. Lords who owned faraway lands, especially in the East, needed people. They needed laborers, craftsmen, young families to build villages, farm the soil, raise new towns. To attract settlers, they hired agents, traveling recruiters, men who moved from town to town, persuading, tempting, and sometimes leading away entire groups. Some promised gold, others land, others still freedom. Such men were often called pipers, not because they played music, but because they led people like a melody leads a dance. They searched for the restless, the dreamers, the unwanted, and they led them away. Sometimes whole villages at once. One version says that on that very day, June 26th, while parents were in church and children played in the square, such a recruiter came to Hamelin, young, charismatic, dressed in bright colors. He spoke to the children. He offered them something, a journey, a treasure, a miracle, and they followed, willingly or under a spell, or simply because they were children. He led them to Transylvania, then a wild, distant land desperate for workers. This theory is supported by records. In some Transylvanian towns of the late 13th century, German surnames appeared that had only existed in Hamelin before. Historians even found ancient notes mentioning the children of Hamlin settling in new lands. But the word children didn't always mean kids. In the Middle Ages, it meant people from, a way to name those who had left a hometown, even if they were 20 years old. So maybe there was no magic, only poverty, hopelessness, and a chance to begin again. But here's the scariest thought. If it's true, why did they leave without a word? Why didn't anyone stop them? Why did no one say goodbye? And why were they never forgiven? Why then tell such a dark story? If the children truly left, by choice or with someone's permission, why did this tale become one of Europe's darkest myths? Why did it grow into a legend of a piper, a flute, and a mountain that swallowed the living? Maybe it was about pain, about guilt, about the fear of telling the truth. What if the children left because they had no choice? What if the parents, tired of hunger, poverty, and despair, agreed to let them go with a stranger, hoping they would have a better life, somewhere far away? And then they regretted it, realized it, but it was too late. So another story began to grow, a legend where no parent was to blame, a tale where a wicked sorcerer enchanted the children and led them away. Because that's easier. Easier to believe your child was taken by magic than to admit you let them go. Easier to say you were powerless against a spell than to admit you didn't follow, you didn't hold their hand, you didn't stop them. That's how the fairy tale was born, first in whispers, then in song, later in writing. At first there were no rats, no magic, only a flute and a departure. Then came symbols and images and metaphors. As the years passed, the truth faded, and the sorrow grew. Memory is strange. It smooths the edges. It decorates. Sometimes it hides. And so the tragedy became a legend, a story where the music is guilty. Not the mother who let her son go, not the father who didn't run after him. That's how this story lives on, like an echo in the mountains, like the sound of guilt that no one in Hamlin could ever silence. But does that make the story less true, or more human? What if it was something much darker? There are versions people don't want to hear, not because they sound unbelievable, but because they're too frightening to imagine. Because behind the fairy tale mask, there might be no migration, no magic, but something far more sinister. Some researchers suggest the children were taken by disease, not just any disease, a selective one. A strange sickness that struck only the young, an unknown illness that came suddenly and vanished just as fast, taking only the bodies not yet strong enough to resist. In the Middle Ages, diseases came without warning, no reasons, no answers. The body trembled, the eyes turned glassy, and that was it. Lightning, not fire. In a world without medicine or hygiene, the death of children was seen as divine punishment. And such a punishment couldn't be spoken aloud, especially if it took them all at once. How could anyone explain the disappearance of an entire generation? It was easier to invent the piper, but there are other theories, even more disturbing. Medieval chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries mention strange outbreaks, episodes of what was later called the Dancing Plague. People, overcome by some force, began to dance. Until they collapsed, until they died. A mass madness. Some blamed demons, others called it a curse. In the city of Erfurt, just 100 miles from Hamlin, in the year 1237, exactly 100 children suddenly began dancing, screaming, spinning, and left the city dancing. They were later found in a nearby village, some dead, others too chained to speak again. A similar story, too similar. Some blame ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations. It could have infected the bread. Others point to mass hysteria, brought on by hunger, fear, and religious panic. But none of these explain why it happened all at once, or why it took only children. And then, there is the shadow, the one no one wants to name. The theory whispered behind closed doors. The theory of ritual, of cults that were never written about, only passed down in whispers. Of ancient rites, where youth was the most precious offering, of secret circles that leave no traces. because that is their purpose. Some believe it wasn't strangers. Maybe it was their own. And to survive the horror, to keep from going mad, people created the image of an outsider. A man in colors, with a flute. Yes, these are only theories. None are proven. None are official. But each one fits the puzzle a little too well. And maybe that is the most terrifying part. Why do we still remember the Pied Piper? More than 7 centuries have passed. Empires rose and fell. Languages vanished. Entire cities were wiped from the map. But the Piper remained. We still tell this story to children, to grandchildren, to one another. Some tell it as a scary fairy tale, others as a legend, and some as truth, hidden in symbols. Why? Why do we return again and again to this tale, where there is no rescue, no forgiveness, no happy ending? Because something in it feels too alive. Something in it feels too human and too terrifying, because it looks too much like us. Maybe no one truly knows what happened in Hamelin on that June day, but something happened, and it left a mark, not only in chronicles and stained glass, but in our memory, in our culture, in that quiet fear, the one that rises when a child doesn't answer for too long, when a strange melody floats through the air, when you suddenly remember. Once, a whole town lost everything, and didn't realize until it was too late. The story of the Pied Piper is not just a tale, it's a warning that broken promises return, that adult indifference has a price, that you should never laugh in the face of the one who holds your fate. Even if all he holds is a tune, it's a parable, a symbol of guilt that time cannot erase, of sorrow that is easier to dress in fantasy than to admit, of a generation that walked away and never came back. And in the end, it's a story about the cost, because betrayal always demands a price, sometimes in gold, sometimes in conscience, and sometimes in the most precious thing you have, your children. Would you have followed the music? If you were a child or an adult, tired, broken, ready to believe anyone who promised relief, would you have followed a voice that sounded so soft, so stirring, it felt like everything you'd ever longed for? Would you have walked where the dream led, or fear, or the promise of a miracle? Real fairy tales don't end with weddings. Real fairy tales don't have to be kind. Real fairy tales are the ones that stay with you. They live in the silence between words. They return in your dreams. They make you turn your head when you hear a strange melody far away, and they whisper quietly. Do you believe in it? Or maybe, just maybe, you were that child once, the one who heard the call and simply forgot. That's why this story stays with us, because forgetting it is impossible.